I'm Jessica Strand, the events coordinator here, and no, I am no relationship to the Strand bookstore. In fact, that is the Bass family. Anyway, tonight I'm thrilled to have Fred Waitzkin, an old family friend, the author of a new novel. And anyway, I am going to introduce, it's going to be many introductions this evening. So I am first starting with Paul, who has helped Fred sort of look at each incarnation of the book over the last 10 years. And so Paul, who's sitting next to me, is a poet, a novelist, a psychotherapist, and a music director of the Lake George Jazz Festival for the last 30 years. He is best known for his novel Tin Angel, based on his experiences in the jazz world, and you owned a jazz club. And his memoir, My Brother's Madness. He met Fred and Josh at Yaddo when Josh was a tiny baby 30 years ago. And during the 10 years it took Fred to write The Dream Merchant, Paul has given him encouragement, and I'm sure many other things. So here is Paul to introduce Fred and Josh.
Hi. I'm here to introduce two people who need no introduction. And I had planned to say something about first meeting Fred and Bonnie with Josh in arms at McDowell, where we were introduced by his mother, Stella, great artist, great painter and sculptress. And Stella said to me, I want you to meet my son, Fred. You have a lot in common. You're both writers, and you both love the sea and fishing. And that should really do it. And it did. Some 38 years later, we have shared both of those parts of our lives. And I just would like to make a comment or two about those parts that we've shared. Fred has taken me on numerous adventures with his seagoing family into the out islands of the Bahamas on a number of occasions. On one of these occasions, we were anchored off a little key, I think it was Little San Salvador, and this is a key way in the southern Bahamas. There's nobody there. We were anchored in a little inlet, and a storm came up at night. And all of a sudden, I was aware of a lot of activity on the deck, and people waking me up quickly. We had to move the boat, or else we ran the risk of being beached on the shore. And in order to pull up an anchor and get a boat moving in the midst of a storm, gale winds and rain, you have to kind of get to the job. And I remember Josh and Fred and a lot of yelling and Josh on the bow and the anchor coming up, and we did what you do when you're in a storm, is you ride into the storm. You ride directly into the waves and directly into the storm, and that's what we did. And as we rode directly into the storm, I said to myself, thank God this guy knows what he's doing. Now, that's a metaphor. It's not only a fact, but it's a metaphor. And it holds true for Fred also as a writer. And I just want to make a couple of brief comments about this book, The Dream Merchant, along these lines. First comment. It's been billed as his first novel, but it's a rich, mature piece of work. It is the flower of a lifetime of creative work and exploration. The second comment I want to make is that the book is touched by genius. And by that I mean the kind of genius that the Greeks and the Romans used to refer to, has the abiding internal spirit who knows the pattern of our destiny and our futures and whispers it to us, and we seldom hear it. And the genius whispers the emerging patterns of our lives, and those who hear it more closely than others express it more clearly than others and are touched by genius. Well, this book does that. This book expresses the inherent and emergent patterns, complex patterns of people's lives as they are whispered by the genius into a clarity. And it's like driving into a storm, driving headlong into the waves. And with this book, as well as off Little San Salvador, reading this book, you can say to yourself, thank God this guy knows what he's doing. Without further ado, I want to introduce Josh, the most able-bodied seaman and investigator of the emerging patterns of life, who will talk with his father about this.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Paul, that was just so beautiful. I think I'm finished now. I can't top it, for sure. I can't approach it. So, now let's just sign some books now.
That was beautiful, Paul. And Jessica, thank you so much for putting this together. Jessica's also an old family friend, and this is an amazing crowd. I have to say, looking out here, it feels like one of those episodes of This Is Your Life. There are people from many, many different dimensions of our existence. So I'm here, my role is of the proud son. I'm incredibly proud of my pop. He's been working on this book for over 10 years. I've had the privilege of reading it probably 25 or 30 times in its various incarnations.
Sick of it?
No, not sick of it. I mean, I've read it a lot. It's a...
Sick of it.
And I can say with, I think with enough detachment from my proud son position that I think it's a masterpiece. I mean, it's an extremely brilliant body of work. I'm not going to go into so much of a description of it myself. I think that what we'll do here is initially I'll ask my dad a few questions about, just to describe what the book is all about, where it came from, and then he'll read a few pages to you. And then I think it would be extremely interesting to go into a discussion of the creative process behind it, because frankly, I think that would be most fascinating. My dad is as you guys know, a lifetime writer. I've learned so much about creativity and learning from him, and that's my life's work. And I think it would be extremely interesting for me to kind of coax him into sharing some of his principles of creativity, of learning, and what really made this book happen from an internal process perspective. So I think that's the real core of what we'll do today, if you guys are game. And then anytime you have a question, please just throw it out. I'd love this to be as much of a group dynamic as possible. So first of all, Pop, tell us what this book is all about.
Yeah, I love that question. You know, I've been trying to figure out what this book is about for about 10 years. It's hard to write such a. This is a complicated story. It's interesting. I think it's sexy. There's a lot of adventure. There's some thoughtfulness involved, and it's hard to get at it with a one-liner. But an entry point is that it deals with a good man who does very, very bad things. It's something I've thought about a lot in my life. You know, we tend to think that bad people do bad things, but good people also do bad things. I've done bad things. I've done things in my life that I have the night sweats about sometimes, things that I wouldn't talk about to too many people. And the central character in my book is a wonderful boy. He's a kind of a prodigy. He grows up in Western Canada. He's a boy of tremendous energy and ingenuity and intelligence. And his father abandons the family when he's 8 years old. And the family is in a starvation situation. It's Depression time. They have no money at all. And the family is about to starve to death. And this kid saves them. He saves the family through his wit and his energy and his good intentions. I won't tell you how. You'll read it in the book. And as he gets older, he becomes a salesman, and he's a terrifically good salesman. He can sell anything to anyone, but he has tremendous ambition, I guess born from the fact that he lived in poverty as a kid. And he crosses lines, as some salesmen do, but he's quite gifted, makes a lot of money, and then loses everything, loses his family, loses his fortune. And then he has this really powerful and dark determination to make it back, make it bigger and better than he ever had before. And so he crosses altogether different lines. He crosses really grave lines and does some terrible things. But interestingly enough, even within that context, to say that he's a good person might be a stretch, but he's a guy that you might like a lot. even though he's into some very dark things. He's just got this charisma. He's got the ability to engender hope, which is very rare. So, in a long paragraph, that's what the book is about.
Who inspired the book? The people in your life, the events? Where did it come from?
You know, when people ask me who are my major literary influences, if I had to name two, they'd be my parents. I came from an unusual family. My dad was a salesman, and in the 50s in Manhattan, he sold fluorescent lighting for office buildings. But he wasn't just a salesman, he was a super salesman. During his heyday, he sold all the big office buildings in his time. The Seagram's building, the Saucony building, Aqueduct Racetrack, the United Nations building. He sold all the big jobs he closed. He literally did more, he closed more business himself than the next 50 salesmen combined. And I worshiped the ground he walked on. I loved him. I loved the conversation of salesmen. You know, I loved the charisma of my dad. I wanted to be a salesman. But at the same time, I had a mother who was a painter, an abstract artist. Later, she became a sculptor. She's quite well known in her own right, Stella Waitzkin. And she disliked everything about my father, including my father. Why they ever got married, I could have wrote a book about, which was called The Last Marlin. That was another book. But
That's another great book.
But she found the idea of her son being a salesman appalling. And she introduced me to writing from when I was a baby. She read me Robert Louis Stevenson. She read me poetry. She read me short stories. She urged me to write stories. I was composing stories when I was 12 and 13 years old, and she would mark them all up with India ink, and they looked like de Kooning sketches, my mother's revisions of my stories. And she gave me The Old Man and the Sea to read when I was 13, and it completely blew my mind. You know, the rhythms of the sentences and the beauty of the descriptions. And she took me to drumming class. She took me to Afro-Cuban drumming class when I was 14 years old, and I became a drummer. I became a pretty good drummer. And I drum to this day with my grandson, who's no longer here, unfortunately. He had to leave. He had an appointment. He's a great guy. He's one of the primary loves of my life. And so when you look at this novel, I mean, it's about a salesman, a super salesman, who crosses a lot of lines, like my dad, who's adored by a lot of people, including the narrator in the book, like I adored my dad. And the art in the book, probably to some extent, comes from my mother. So,
You want to read a few pages?
You want to hear a few pages? Yeah. Okay. Switch glasses.
While he switches glasses, I'll tell you that watching my dad write this book has been incredible, because it was very much like a birth that happened over the course of a decade. He put so much heart and soul into it. He suffered with it. He became these characters. I mean, for periods of time, and we'll discuss his creative process here and some of the relationships that he formed while writing it, but it was astonishing to see. And I'm the biggest fan of my dad's work. There is out there, although sometimes he's written about me, which has made my life a little bit complicated. We have an agreement he's not going to do that anymore. Hopefully he sticks to it. And it's very important he doesn't write about my baby. My wife has said, never write about Jack, and he has not agreed. But one of the things about my dad is he writes about what he knows. He writes about the people he knows, and he writes about himself. And one of the most interesting components of this book is the relationship of the narrator to the central characters. And the way he's built this narrator, I think, is one of the really superb components of the piece of art. So that's what I'd like to get into after he reads this. And you could think about it while he reads this section. I think that what Fred's done with the narrator of this book is rather unique.
I guess I have to tell you a few things before I start reading this section. The book begins on Bimini Island, which is a tiny island. I've gone to this island since I was 12 years old or 13 years old when my dad first took me there. It's a very, very small island. It's just 7 miles long and about, a long baseball's throw wide. In certain ways, it's very similar today than it was when I first went there a lot of years ago. The narrator is sitting at a bar on the south end of North Bimini, which is called the End of the World Saloon. He knows the bartender. It's just a plywood shack with a sand floor. It's tiny. It's on a little spit of land, right on the water. You can hear the ocean, the tide running past. You can hear tarpon and jacks jumping in the tide. It's kind of an intoxicating place. He likes to go there and drink and listen to music. At the other end of the bar, there's a guy about 55 years of age that he doesn't know. And the narrator is talking to the bartender. And this other guy who he doesn't know comes over and starts to interrupt and starts to tell, to say, well, are you a fisherman here? I mean, will you tell me about fishing? I mean, he's very, he has a certain urgency about him, and he's and the narrator is annoyed at first, but there's something winsome about this guy. And within 10 minutes, he finds himself opening up to this fellow who turns out to be Jim, who's the protagonist of the novel. And he finds himself telling Jim his fishing secrets, and as sometimes happens between all of us, men and women and women and women and men and men, they start talking intimately very quickly. And within a few hours, they're sitting at the bar and they're telling each other the secrets of their lives. And as they drink more and more, the narrator feels an unusual affection for this other man, because on some level he reminds him of his father, of his own father. And he says to him, listen, now what I should have said is that this guy Jim owns a big boat, very, very expensive boat, a 60-footer. It's worth, like, let's say, $500,000 or $1 million. And he's cruising with his wife. But he doesn't really know much about boats, but the narrator knows a lot about boats. So the narrator says to this guy Jim, why don't we take a cruise together for a few days? Me and you. I'll show you the waters here. I'll take you fishing. We'll catch fish. You don't know the waters here. If you go without me, you won't catch anything. But if we go together, we'll catch a lot of fish. And this guy Jim, he agrees to this preposterous proposal to take a guy out in the boat that he's never met for 4 or 5 days in his $1 million yacht. But then they're so drunk that retrospectively, the narrator doesn't know if he dreamed this or if it was true. So he goes down to the dock, to the marina, a couple days later, and sure enough, this gorgeous yacht pulls up, run by this fellow Jim and his wife. They pull into the dock. The narrator gets aboard with his wife, and they go away. They go off. And so now I'm going to read to you some pages about the... You hold it? Should you hold the book?
No,
I have to hold it. Am I not speaking loudly enough?
That's perfect.
It's okay?
That's good right there.
Okay. So now I'm going to read you straight now, just the beginning of their trip together. Our first days on their yacht were a dream vacation fantasy. Phyllis's sumptuous 4-course meals. Phyllis is his third wife, also a younger wife. This protagonist, he's taken with younger women. And he has a number of transformations in his life, several. And in each of these transformations, a younger woman is a part. She enables him to become something else, to shed his skin and begin again. And this is his third wife, Phyllis. She's a very important character. He was all about gamesmanship, betting, proposing dares, playing in the sea, enjoying the best cigars, discovering life's possibilities each morning after his oatmeal. Jim was 6 foot and powerfully built, particularly in the chest and shoulders, his sandy hair thinning, and with a light complexion that burned easily in the Bahamian sun. Phyllis served him hand and foot, literally. Every afternoon after diving, she gave him massages. She walked along his back, cracking his spine with her little feet. She smeared goop on his lips to protect him from the sun. Phyllis mixed his drinks and handed him Cuban cigars. She seemed good-hearted, affable, and dumb. That was my first impression. In the evening, she showered on the deck and waved whenever I glanced her way. She was nice to look at. The girls cooked together in the galley, got along okay, although I didn't think much about them. I was focused on Jim. On the third day out, I guided him to an isolated atoll about 70 miles south of Bimini called Orange Cay. It was hardly more than a large rock, but the surrounding reefs were untouched by local fishermen who couldn't afford the fuel to travel halfway to Cuba. There were lobsters, snappers, and groupers carpeting the bottom. So much game here that it felt unsporting to drop a line or dive down and spear them. But I never said that to Jim. He was in heaven, and I wanted to please him. He had that effect on all of us. Every afternoon he came out of the water with his pole spear, like James Bond, and presented a bucket of fish and crawfish for the girls to cook. Of course, any idiot could catch fish in such a place, but still I felt like a big shot for having brought him here. I suggested playing gin rummy. It felt like a manly contest, and I was good at cards. The first night playing with Jim, I won $30 or $40. I knew that I would. In my circle of friends, I nearly always won. The second night, I gradually lost back nearly everything. With a swagger that was not my own, I suggested raising the stakes. Jim didn't seem to care. "Whatever you want, buddy," he said. I held my own for a while, and then I began to lose. I was down 500 before we quit, much more than I ever lost at cards. But it didn't matter. Jim evoked the larger picture while he racked up the score against me. What was 500 when we were having such a good time, bantering about women, diving for lobsters, eating caviar and the best seafood, drinking wine beneath a galaxy of stars? He knew how to live. He would take me to places that I could not begin to imagine. That was implicit in the largesse of those unforgettable days on Jim's yacht. On the fifth night out, we were sitting on the aft deck, drinking beer and watching gulls from the tiny island wheeling behind the stern in the glow of the anchor light. I knew that he wanted to play cards, and he was waiting for me to ask him. The girls were below in the galley. Jim reached for a cigar in his shirt pocket, but then he put it back. In that moment, all the banter went out of his face. "Look there," he said. "What?" He was pointing off the stern at a pinpoint of light in the distance, hardly anything at all. "Wait here," he said curtly. He walked into the salon, and I watched him disappear down the stairs. Minutes passed, and I began to feel uneasy on the aft deck by myself, peering off the stern at a light growing larger in the blackness. The sting of Jim's voice had put me on edge. I couldn't hear our wives inside the galley laughing. I wished they'd be quiet. Possibly, it was another fishing boat, but that would be unusual so far off the beaten track. These days, the Miami Herald was filled with stories of cocaine trafficking in remote areas of the Bahamas. American cruisers anchored in the wrong place had been attacked by Colombian drug smugglers. Tourists were shot to death and thrown over the side. I tried to steady my imagination, but then the lights went off in the salon, and the anchor light went out. Everything was very quiet, but I could hear my beating heart, and also the rumbling of an inboard engine idling closer. Jim returned holding 2 automatic rifles. He slammed the clip into one and put it into my hands. I didn't know anything about shooting guns, and the weapon felt heavy and forbidding. The girls were still laughing, but now they seemed miles away. My stomach knotted up. I was thinking, put the gun away, Jim, before something terrible happens. His expression was entirely focused, but also he seemed to be relishing the moment, which alarmed me more than the approaching boat. "What the hell are you doing, man?" I said, and Jim cut me off with a hand slammed against my mouth. "What are you doing, man?" I repeated to myself. I was beginning to shake. "Not a sound," he ordered. He didn't want to hear from me, not now, when the speedboat was only 100 yards off and edging closer in the dark, calm water. Now I could make out its narrow, sleek hull. It was sliding right up to our stern. Then a voice called from the boat in a heavy Spanish accent. "Do you know where we are?" What a preposterous question to ask in the middle of nowhere. How are we supposed to answer? The sleek boat kept edging forward, and Jim motioned for me to get down on the deck. Once again, "Do you know where we are?" The man's voice was cloying with sweet innocence. It was disgusting. Jim seemed to see something. He raised the gun fast, hesitated a beat, and squeezed off 3 rounds. Holy shit! In a second, 2,000 horsepower was roaring, and the speedboat wheeled on its haunches, throwing white water on us. And for a moment, I saw the alarmed face of the man at the wheel, staring back as the boat shot off into the darkness. "Did you see the other guy pointing a rifle from the companionway?" Jim asked, lowering his own gun. I hadn't seen a second man. I'd never seen anything like this before in my life. I was trying to pull my heart back into my chest. Were they going to kill us? What do you think? Are they coming back? What's going to happen? He shrugged. I still didn't get it. Was this for real or a paranoid fantasy that Jim was filling up with life? I had no idea if he hit the men or shot to scare them. I hadn't seen any rifles except our own. "We'll have to stand guard through the night," Jim said, as though situations like this were normal in life. I tried to imagine how we'd hold them off, where I'd fit in. I was a writer from New York, not the right guy to go into a gunfight with. The rifle felt clammy and too heavy for me to hold up. Honestly, I wanted to hide down below with the girls. He led me up the companionway and positioned us on opposite ends of a Boston whaler on the top deck. He took my rifle and clicked off the safety, so I was ready to shoot. "Don't pull the trigger by accident," he said. "I've seen that before." I nodded, pulling my right hand away from the stock. Looking across the taut canvas cover, I could see 2 lights in the distance moving back and forth. No, 3 lights. What the hell was going on out there? I couldn't tell if they were coming closer or moving off. How could we defend ourselves against an armada of drug smugglers? But why were they coming for us? Jim had stopped answering my questions. The waiting was too much. After a half hour like this, clutching the gun against my knee, I was simply going crazy. To break the tension, I asked, "What did you do in Brazil?" So, that's enough. Yeah, that's good.
So Pop, the way you narrate The Dream Merchant is so unusual. And maybe you could spend a little time describing to everybody how you constructed the narrator's relationship to Jim and Mara.
Tricky question. When I started writing this book, I thought that I would have an omniscient narrator. I'd write a novel like Thackeray, one of those guys. And I worked on it for 2 years that way. But it wasn't working because the central character was too chilly. I couldn't summon forth the affection that I wanted a reader to have for the central character while he was doing a lot of the stuff that he does in the book. So I had to reconceive it, and I developed a friendship between a narrator with this character. That was one way in which the book is narrated, but there's also another way. The book is told, by and large, from the end of the man's life, moving backwards. And Jim, I don't want to give away too much of the plot. When I'm talking about the book now, I have to sort of avoid the rocks and shoals of the plot while describing what happened in the book, if such a thing is possible. But to try to do that, the narrator's at the end of his life. I'm sorry, the central character, Jim, is at the end of his life. He's down and out, he's broke, and he's trying to redeem himself or remake himself one more time. He's done this 3 or 4 times. He's in Israel. He's a salesman. He's at the bottom of the line again. He's dead broke. He's just floundering, and he's in front of a room of people. He's doing network marketing, and he's trying to sell this group of people into his business. And it's a room not unlike this, maybe as many people as there are today, this evening. And he notices a girl in the audience, very young, very beautiful. She's 26 years old. We find out later. And she's riveted on this story he's telling. And he doesn't understand it because it seems like disproportionate, because he doesn't even believe in the story he's telling so much, but she believes in it. And she comes up to him afterwards, and they start to talk. And she's incredibly intrigued with him. He can't understand exactly why, but on the other hand, he's moved and titillated by her attention. To make a long story short, they become involved. We wonder for a great deal of this novel why this woman is involved with this older man. But needless to say, they're involved. He falls desperately in love with her, and he tells her his story. So while we learn about their relationship, we learn about the story, the central story of the book, through their relationship. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And why did it take you 10 years to write? This is something that in the family we all make fun of my dad about, because he's an incredibly slow writer. His process involves layering. But what's fascinating, if I can say for a moment, is that in the last month and a half, there's been this astonishing breakthrough, because he's on this book tour. And he's writing all of these blog posts for the Huffington Post and these various, big papers, and it's kind of blowing my mind, because my pop is suddenly whipping out these 10 and 15-page papers in a day or two, which has never happened. So it's a very interesting moment. While you've broken through to this very fluid process now. Tell us about the 10 years it took to write this layered novel.
Well, the first way I have to respond to that is I don't think of it as a long time. I mean, like so many people have come up to me and said, are you still working on that book? As if I should have written 3 other books since then. But to me, it was my life. I was living my life, and I was writing my book. I was enjoying my book. I was into the story. I was conceiving the story. I was going fishing in the summers. I was watching football and basketball during the seasons. Life was going on, and I was writing my book. It seemed to make sense to me. But people kept saying, why so long, Waitzkin? And so I started worrying about it. Maybe I should have written 3 books instead of this 1 book. And would that have been better? I don't know. I mean, as I started to say at the beginning, I made some wrong turns at the beginning. I tried to write it with an omniscient narrator. Then that wasn't working. And I mean, there's a lot of technical reasons why it took me a long time. But I'm slow. And also, there was a lot of research involved. I mean, a lot of my background is in journalism. I've written a lot of feature journalism over the years, and when I started out as a journalist, I kind of thought that being a journalist was not the great. I thought it was kind of like the lower rung of being a writer, but I was wrong. I learned a great deal about being a writer from journalism, and one of the things that I learned was that story is an important part of a story. When I started writing, I thought angst was what a story had to be about. Depression, melancholia, death, fear of death. But from the magazine work, I found out there was things other than angst. And I started putting them in. So, I concocted this story, and the story sort of grew. It grew over time. And one of the things that I came to was this idea. Maybe I'm running a little far afield from your question, but I'll just go with it. In 1984, which was the year that I started writing Searching for Bobby Fischer, I also happened to read in a magazine, Time magazine, an article about gold mining in Brazil. And it was about the weirdest, craziest, most interesting thing I'd ever read in my life. It described these little empires in the middle of the Amazon, lawless little empires called garimpos. And what it is kind of like, maybe it would be twice the size of this room. And it would consist of a cantina, a bar, a barracks, and a whorehouse. And around the circumference of this garimpo, you would have miners digging in the earth, in the mud pits, for gold nuggets and gold flakes. And the whole idea was that the miners would make a lot of money, and they'd be able to sell the gold, and they'd be able to go back to civilization and bring their family out of poverty. But it never really worked that way, because what would happen is that the miners would dig for a month in this filthy environment. They'd get sick, some of them. They'd die of dengue fever and malaria. Others of them would be slaughtered by jaguars, because the jaguars were rife in this area. And the only one that ever made a buck out of this was the owner of the garimpo. But what made it even more inherently evil is that at the end of a month, a miner would smell the good food coming from the garimpo. And there'd be music that that would be blasted out into the jungle through these huge speakers, Frank Sinatra tunes. And these miners, hundreds of them, would come into the, not hundreds in a night, but let's say 50 or 70 in a night, would come into this cantina. And in one night, with the girls and the food and the booze, they'd spend all of the money that they'd made in that month digging in the pit. So they had to go back out in the pit again. It was Sisyphusian. It just never ended. No one ever made anything except the guy that owned it. And so I had this idea that I had to write about this someday. It was just so interesting and sensual and crazy and unlikely and murderous. And so when I started writing the novel, I sort of had this idea that ultimately Willy Loman would have to go into the jungle and become Kurtz. That was sort of my master plan if I could pull it off. But to pull it off, I had to know the jungle. So Josh and I went there. We went there and we spent a month there. I mean, we saw all this stuff. All the stuff I just described, we saw. So there was research involved with the book. It's another reason it took me so long. But I'm slow. I'm slow, really slow.
There aren't too many audiences that would have gotten that joke.
Well, how about some questions from these guys? Yeah?
Well, but just let me ask one more question, then we'll go into it, because I think it's a really interesting, interesting thing to get into. So exploring the trip that we took to Brazil, to Manaus, was incredible. We spent a big period of time in the jungle.
Okay.
And the research. Were you okay?
I've got a mic next to you.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Whenever you.
And my dad's research in the book had a lot of different flavors. There were many dimensions of it, and I think it would be extremely interesting for you to describe a little bit of how you constructed the character of Ava, because it was one of the most unusual processes that I've ever seen from a writer. It was really creative. It's an incredible character in the book. Maybe you should describe it a little bit.
Okay. Okay. Is Maya here? Maya's here. Okay, Maya, you ready? I knew Ava is Jim's second wife, and she was a very, very important character in my conception. Arguably the second most important character in the book. And I knew what I wanted in this character early on. I mean, like many years ago. I knew what I wanted in the character, but I didn't know how to get it. I wanted a woman like, you guys know the movie The Hustler with Paul Newman? Do you remember his girlfriend? She was played by Piper Laurie. She was beautiful, but she was tarnished. She was available, but she was even more seductive and beautiful and compelling for being available and damaged. I wanted that kind of a woman, but I'd never known a woman like that before. How was I going to do that? Because I believe, like Graham Greene, that you have to have a sense of character from real life if you're going to write her beautifully, or him beautifully. You can't just make it up. I think that fiction always has an antecedent in reality. But I'd never known a woman like this. I didn't know how to do it. So I talked about it with Josh. Josh had a suggestion. He said, you know, I have a friend that's got a beautiful girlfriend. Why don't you take her out to lunch? So I took Maya. She's in the room back there. She's beautiful, you can see. She's also very smart and very deep. I took her out to a restaurant, and I described Ava to her. And I talked for an hour, and she didn't say anything. And I didn't think this was working at all. I thought this was an interesting idea, but a failure. And at the end of the hour, she got up from the table, and I think I said to her something like, I don't think it's going to work out. And she turned to me and she said, I can do this. And her whole being had darkened. It was spooky. It was really spooky. She was Ava. And then for the next year, was it a year, Maya? Over a year. We'd meet maybe once a month in my office. I'd send her a long email, and I'd tell her what Ava does in the book, or what my conception is, and she'd come to my office, and we'd block it out together. And by the end of the year, she was Ava. I didn't even have to tell her what the lines were. She knew the lines. It was amazing. It was an amazing experience. I've never done anything before or since. She was amazing. if you're ever looking for a muse.
I have a lot more questions, but maybe we should open it up and take some questions from the audience. Would anyone like to ask Fred anything?
Do I need to turn it on? Or is it on? Oh, it is. Without giving too much away, I was somewhat surprised by the ending. Did you have that in your head from the start, or were there a lot of alternates floating about out there?
Well, when you say the ending, and I'm not going to go there except to try to answer it abstractly. I had the last line in mind. I was shooting for that last line for the last 200 pages. Which is interesting because, you know, I'm a great believer in not knowing everything about what you're going to do. I don't write very complete outlines. I think that, and I've been writing about this recently, I believe that the creative process is often misunderstood by a lot of people. I think that for me in writing, the most interesting things that come out are the things that I didn't expect would come out. So that when I look back on my own writing, what delights me the most and what interests me most were things that weren't in my outline. But in this particular instance, I had that line. And it gave me a lot of confidence to write to that line. Thanks.
Anyone else?
What do you do when you get stuck as a writer?
You do a lot of stuff. You know, you do a lot of stuff. You sometimes, for starters, I always go back to the well. You know, if I'm working on a paragraph and it's not opening up for me, I go back to it. I pace around. I do a little bit of Tai Chi. I go back. I take a look at it again. It's still not opening up to me. I'll turn on sports radio, get my mind off it. I'll go back to it. If it's still not working, I call my friend Jeff and say, let's have lunch. But then I'm really on the line because I got to meet him for lunch in 45 minutes. So I'm sweating and I haven't written a sentence all day. That often works.
This last part of his creative process has driven his family crazy since I was a baby, because what happens is that we're about to leave on a trip, or we come back from a boat trip, and we have to pack up the whole boat for 2 days. And then my dad decides that because he only has this tiny period of time, he has to write. And so he'll disappear, and then my mom and I are doing everything. But the idea of mining for urgency, it's very interesting how it can drive a family crazy. But my pop is really brilliant at mining for inspiration. Creating pockets of urgency, so you have to pull it out. Tell us more about where you draw your inspiration.
You know, I'm a scavenger. I mean, I'll take it from anywhere I can find it. I mean, I'll go down to Starbucks and I'll talk to the girls that work there because I'm charmed by them. You know, I'll talk to Jamie when she comes to work on my terrible back, and then I'll feel inspired when she leaves, and sometimes I'll be able to write something. You know, if I'm at the beginning of a project, I'll go someplace that's exciting to me. Islands work very well for me. I'll do that. If I'm really stuck, I'll go to one of several people and talk to them. I'll go to Paul. I'll go to Josh. I'll go to Bonnie. Bonnie often bails me out. You know, we'll have a conversation about what I'm working on. And very often, she'll have the answer. If she doesn't have the answer, just talking about it will get me going. I mean, I look all over the place for inspiration.
I was wondering how much your night dreams played a role. Did you ever wake up in the morning and you're like, with like a scene fully formed? I'm just curious.
I'm not going to say that that's never happened, but it could happen. And the dreams are very important to me. I see dreams as kind of like a portal, you know, to an area of our being, which is very important for a writer. I mean, I use the word unconscious. I don't know if a psychologist would agree with that or not. I wouldn't argue with that. But like, when I'm starting a project, a writing project, I pay a lot of attention to my dreams. And if I'm not dreaming and I can't remember my dreams, I put a pad behind my bed, and before I turn my light on, I grab my pad and I start scribbling. And I find that puts puts me in contact with a part of myself that maybe I'm not so much in contact with. And if I can establish a dialogue with that, with myself that way, then I can go other places with that. And I'll give you an example of that. I mean, there's this trick. It's almost become a literary cliche with writers, but I think it's genius that Ernest Hemingway talks about in one of the Paris Review interviews. He says that at the end of a writing day, he always leaves something unwritten that he might have written. Now, I always do that. If I'm working on a chapter and I know what the last paragraph is, or I have a sense for it, I don't write it. I get on my bike, I ride home along the river, and that paragraph is percolating. Maybe somewhere on the bike ride home, or maybe when I get home and I'm talking to Bonnie, or maybe when I'm watching a basketball game, all of a sudden something surfaces and I get an insight about that paragraph that I didn't have when I had it in mind before. And then when I go to the office the next day, if I'm really on a roll, it doesn't always work like this way, I wish it did, but if I'm on a roll, then I'll see things in that paragraph the second day that I didn't have a clue about in the first day when I thought I knew the paragraph to write. I think all of this is connected to the dreams, but it's not quite the same as waking up in the morning and having the whole chapter in front of you.
This process, my dad told me about when I was a kid, and it was really integral to my chess career from when I was very, very young, and then into my martial arts life. Everything that I've done, this idea of going to sleep, posing oneself a question, don't think about it, wake up in the morning, and then open the mind to it. And what's interesting is that I've trained peak performers in different fields, in business, investing, in sports, and it's fascinating how, from a cross-disciplinary perspective, you can tap this thing. It's unbelievable, and most people are so addicted to inputs that first thing when they wake up in the morning, they check their email, which I think is basically the most efficient way to crimp your connection between your conscious and your unconscious mind. It's very destructive, as opposed to setting a question, waking up first thing in the morning and pouring it out creatively. My dad taught me this when I was a little boy, and I would always study chess positions late afternoon, early evening, stop thinking about them, wake up in the morning and think about them again, and I either have the solution or a sense of direction about where the solution might be. I think this can be applied in almost any creative field. It's very powerful. I learned a lot from my dad.
I've learned a lot from him. Not just a cliche.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Who do I read now? My last two books, I read the Junot Diaz book. This is why we lose her. This is how we lose her. It's a wonderful book of connected short stories that's intoxicating with Latin rhythms and insight about life. And that was a beautiful book. And then I read another short novel by Georges Simenon, who was a great French writer. Some of you guys that are over 50 would know him. He wrote about 300 novels, but 8 or 9 straight novels, others detective novels. And this one novel, The Train, blew my mind. It's about 120 pages, and I won't describe it to you, except it's a great book. You should pick it up. Those are the last two.
To what extent is the conversation between the narrator and Jim a conversation between you and your father?
Great question, Alex. I think it's it's kind of like the conversation I might have with my father, as distinct from a conversation I had with my father. I mean, my father died when I was 27 years old, and the narrator is probably a bit older than that, and Jim is. It's not a conversation I ever had with my father, but it was surely inspired by things that came from my father. Who had no voice? That's right. My father lost his voice. Do you want to follow through on that? Looks like I haven't satisfied you. I'll try again.
You satisfied me with this.
But not with the question.
No, the question is part of it.
Okay. Okay. Jeff.
Was there a particular novelist, more than others, who proved an inspiration in the course of writing this book? And if so, how so?
I don't know that I say that, but I mean, like, there's so many novelists that I've admired. I mean, I've admired Marquez so much as a novelist, and I think some of that probably came into this book. But truly, I just can't pin it down to one. I mean, whenever anyone asks me who was the most important writer to you, I'd have to say Hemingway, because although as I've gotten older, I think I've evolved away from Hemingway. During my formative years, he was so important to me. I learned how to write sentences from him. I fell in love with his subject matter. But I wouldn't say that this particular book is necessarily Hemingway-esque. In fact, I don't think it is.
Conrad?
Yeah, okay, he reminded me. That's absolutely correct. One of my favorite books is Heart of Darkness, and without a question, I was describing before the scene in Brazil, and it was very, very Conradian. I mean, the scene that I experienced in Brazil, that I wrote about in Brazil, and that I wrote in this novel. I mean, that was inspired by Conrad.
When this book gets to Brazil, it really is, it goes to an incredibly dark place. It's a wild, wild part of the book. I actually, maybe 4 years ago, was telling my dad, maybe we should start the book in Brazil. Because once you get there, it's like it hits the accelerator and it's unbelievable. And we had a lot of debates about this. I mean, it's an incredible, incredible life in the jungle of complete moral degradation and wild adventure. It's an amazing, amazing piece of the book.
Paul, you look like you have a question. Okay.
Fred.
Yes, Mike.
Tell us about the decision to cut material that you worked on for Conrad.
Yeah, well, Mike was one of my earlier readers, and
Mike's the greatest cutter of material that I've ever known.
And Mike is a terrific writer. He's a novelist and a great journalist, and he read early drafts of this book, and there are a bunch of friends here. I'm not going to start naming names because I'll leave somebody out, but there's a bunch of people in this room that really were terrific to me in the sense that they read the book, that they loved the book, that they made suggestions. There was a lot in this book that came out. I mean, there was a lot of backstory, for example. You haven't read the book yet, but Jim has a remarkable life as a child. And I wrote a novella about his life in childhood, and then I took it out. Don, my agent and a great editor, urged me to take a lot of it out, and he was right, because, and this is speaking to the point that Josh was getting at, to work, you had to feel Brazil from the beginning of this book. You had to know it was coming, you had to sense it was coming, you had to love what you were reading and know that it was moving someplace very dark, inexorably. And that meant that some soft underbelly had to come out, even though I had a lot of affection for pages that I took out.
Any other questions? Before we close, I just want to say that our family is sort of a little writing workshop. We're a family of writers, and my mom, whose birthday is tomorrow, is just the most important piece of that puzzle without any question. I mean, she's a heroic mother, she's an unbelievable wife. And she has, if I've read this book 30 times, she's probably read this book maybe 80 or 90 times. She knows every sentence and has been such a huge part of the creative process. So we have to say that.
And let me add to that. I mean, and beyond great line changes, which she's fantastic, Bonnie tells me where to go when I get lost. Just like on the boat.